You're listening to episode 274 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Tami Simon joins us to speak about Sounds True and the new book, The Dharma of Dogs, Our Best Friends as Spiritual Teachers. Hi, everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. If listening to the Dharma is something you like doing, you may have encountered Sounds True as one of the most comprehensive resources for contemplative practice. Today we're joined by their pioneering founder to learn more about its background and to share stories about some of our four-footed Dharma teachers, dogs. Tami Simon founded Sounds True at the age of 22 with the mission of disseminating spiritual wisdom. As a pioneer in the conscious business movement, she focuses on bringing authenticity and heart to the workplace while honoring multiple bottom lines. Tami hosts a popular weekly podcast called Insights at the Edge, where she has interviewed many of today's leading teachers, delving deeply into their discoveries and personal experiences on their own journeys. Tami lives with her partner, Julie Kramer, and their spoodle, Raspberry, in Boulder, Colorado. Special thanks to Cosma McDermott for her coordination of today's interview. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice black dog tea. Our guest today is Tami Simon. Tami, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ted. Glad to be here with you.
I'm so very glad to have you here because I've been a big fan of Sounds True for so long. So I'm rather eager to get into the conversation about that and about our other topic today. But let's start by having you tell us about your background.
Well, let's see. I would say that I've had could call it a hunger or a passionate thirst for spiritual teachings since a very young age. And for me, when I first got a book by Hermann Hesse that my sister gave me, Siddhartha, I read that book maybe at age 14 or 15. There was a sense of encountering something that was more important than anything else I'd ever encountered in my life. I remember sleeping with the book under my pillow. I remember particularly reading the sections about Siddhartha by the river and the quality of the sound of the river. And I knew that there was something there for me that would feed this hunger or quench this thirst that nothing else in my conventional education and relatively conventional family was touching, but that I desperately needed as a person. And I think that thread has gone through my whole life. I went to Swarthmore College thinking I would study philosophy and ended up being a religion major. And even in studying religion, wanted to move deeper into direct experience and saw that in the world of academia, the kinds of questions that I was asking and the kind of writing that I wanted to do about the kinds of questions I was asking wasn't really welcome. And I left college and went to Sri Lanka, India, and Nepal for a year at age 20, 21 to study meditation and to really immerse myself in the spiritual path, if you will. And at that time, early in my life, I made a commitment that I would bring the practice of meditation and other contemplative practices to as many people as possible when I returned to the United States. And in many ways, I think that was really the seed of Sounds True, and that it was planted in my being during that year of traveling in Asia, and that sense of a prayer, a cry, if you will, that I wanted to bring these teachings to as many people as possible because it was what I found the most meaningful.
So once you got back from that trip and knowing from the timeline this is about when Sounds True started, what did you do? What were the steps that you took to get that moving and make it a reality?
Sure. Well, I think we have to just to paint a realistic picture here, which is that when I came back from those travels, I was actually in pretty beat up shape in a certain kind of way. I only weighed 90 pounds, which was quite thin. I won't tell you what that is compared to my current weight, but let's just say I was super thin. And part of it was I had done 4 10-day intensive meditation retreats, Vipassana retreats with Goenka when he was alive and teaching in India back in 1983. And those retreats were quite profound. They were like boot camp. You meditated from 5 in the morning till 10 at night. And my nervous system couldn't really handle it. Actually, I threw myself in so completely that you could say I threw myself over, not just in. And so, I came back and not only was I thin, but I wasn't talking very much, which is what really concerned my parents at the time. When I was a very young person, I was called Big Mouth by my members of my family because I seemed to always be talking at the dinner table, etc. So here I was not talking, and I wasn't talking because I thought people talked a lot of the time conversationally just to fill space, and I didn't feel the need to fill space. But other people found this quite disconcerting. So even though I had this deep intention inside me to bring these teachings to as many people as possible, I really didn't know how to do it. So it was a seed that was planted, but it was underground. And meanwhile, I was being pressured by my family. Could you please get a degree of some kind? Please. That's the ticket to the rest of your life, et cetera, et cetera. And I ended up coming out to Boulder, Colorado, and going to Naropa to study psychology and meditation, really because I wanted to try to understand a bit what had happened to me and what was happening inside me, what was the transformative process that I was in. But I discovered when I came out here that I didn't want to really be in school anymore. And at that point, my parents said, okay, support yourself. I said, you're right, I should support myself. And okay, so this is a 21-year-old who's really kind of lost in the darkness. And yet I had this inner sense, but I didn't know how it would unfold. And I started hosting a radio program where I would interview spiritual teachers because it was a way that I thought I could continue the education that I wanted outside of an academic setting. And so I interviewed various teachers that came through Boulder, Colorado at the local public radio station. And that was one part of my life that made a lot of sense while I was supporting myself waitressing in a greasy Chinese restaurant. And at this point, my father dies. And when my father died, I inherited a small amount of money, about $50,000. And one of the people that I was interviewing for the community radio show, he and I were having some discussions in preparation for the interview. And I mentioned to him that I had inherited this money and I didn't know what to do with it. And he said, why don't you put it into yourself? Why don't you invest in yourself? And I was like, that's a great idea, but I don't know what to do with myself. And he said, come back in 3 days and we'll talk about it. And as I walked out of his office, actually, I was given a gift by the universe. I don't quite know how else to put it, or from my unconscious mind, but I felt very odd walking out of his office, almost like I was walking off the ground a few feet. And I heard an interior voice that said, disseminate spiritual wisdom. And I knew that's what I would do. I knew it. I mean, I had this feeling of, as I said, being given a gift. And then I started feeling like I was walking on the ground and I started thinking about how to do it. And it was pretty clear to me that using audio would be the best approach because I loved the radio show that I was hosting. People already asked me for copies of the interview program that I hosted. I would sell 3 or 4 copies for $10 a cassette, and I had a little dubbing unit at home. And I wasn't particularly interested in video. My parents watched a lot of television, and I found that quite concerning. And I wasn't really interested in book publishing at the time because I thought a lot of other people are already in that very mature business, but audio and disseminating spiritual wisdom through audio is a new pioneering business. Books on tape were just becoming popular. And I wasn't so interested on books on tape. I thought, just like all of the great Dharma talks I listened to when I was being trained in Vipassana meditation, we can make those kinds of talks and recordings available. And it will be original spoken word audio. And that's how we'll disseminate spiritual wisdom through Sounds True.
So you have this some good connections, I imagine, with some of the folks that you've interviewed. Did you return 3 days later? What happened?
Well, I shared with this gentleman who is actually a very successful Colorado entrepreneur, but I was interviewing him because he had these huge crystals in his windows. And I walked by them every day and I wanted to learn more about crystals at the time. But anyway, I came back and I shared with him what I wanted to do. And he said, look, I own that whole building across the street. You're welcome to rent an office out of it. And I got started.
So I'm wondering if you can share for a few minutes for those who may not be familiar with Sounds True, what that is, how is that manifested today, and what's offered?
Sure. So as I tell you this story, this all happened 32 years ago. And we began as a spoken word audio publishing company. And at the time we used these high-speed cassette duplication machines, and you could put together several sleeved units that linked together, and you could take a master cassette and make a dozen copies right there live at a workshop as soon as it was over. So that's how we started. And over time, we developed a healing music division, an instructional video division. In 2000, we started publishing books and audiobook combination products. And then more recently, we've expanded, and it's a big part of our business now, is online learning and online summits and digital subscriptions. We have about between 110 and 120 employees. Vacillates. We have, I think, 10 open positions right now at the company. And then there's about 20 or so dogs that come in to work here as well. We have 2 buildings in Louisville, Colorado, which is right outside of Boulder.
It's interesting, this growth, because I could hear your tone of excitement and maybe a little bit of nostalgia for the tapes, the high speed, and how it was by what you can accomplish today, such a limited release, and yet that was the beginnings. That was that seed popping its way up to the ground right there.
Well, I mean, the nostalgia over the cassette, I used to think the cassette was just so powerful. Here's this a small little piece of plastic with some magnetic media inside, and yet you could put 95 minutes on it and it could completely change your outlook on life forever if you listened to 95 minutes. I mean, for me in the early days, 95 minutes of Ram Dass or Stephen Levine, and then Eckhart Tolle and Adyashanti and Pema Chodron. And I mean, these recordings have been so powerful in my own life. So it was all of this revolutionary power packed into a cassette.
So aside from, of course, technology and growing so much, I'm wondering how things have changed over the years. Has the environment become more receptive? I mean, what have you noticed has been different over time?
Yeah, well, I definitely think the marketplace as a whole has changed tremendously. So yes, there's all the format changes. I'm talking about cassette, and then we moved to CD, and then we moved to digital media, and now, of course, it's mobile and delivering our content in short form daily teachings via apps. So I mean, there's a whole format change. When I started, even just the word meditation, it was seen as something that people who joined the Hare Krishna movement did. It was not very popular. It was seen as very weird and very niche. And this was before all of the neuroscientific studies were published that gave evidence to the power of contemplative practice. So it was just seen as something kind of religious weirdos did, to be honest. And yet, that was okay. It was, mysticism. These are the mystical traditions. So it was very niche. And of course, that's not true today. As we know, there are so many podcasts, so much interest in meditation and mindfulness today. It's blossoming, it's burgeoning. So it's a very different field of receptivity. In terms of my own experience, in terms of what's different, I think probably the biggest thing is that when I started with me and a handful of people, and it's only been in really the last few years that we've been able to create a true professional management team at the company. And I've had the great good fortune of working with some really talented business people and people who really function well in organizations. And, SoundsTrue has become a real professionally managed business. And I've learned so much from so many of the people I've worked with. So that's, I think, our newest frontier and what's allowing us to grow and thrive in today's world.
I'm wondering what you are most pleased with about Sounds True, just looking over the years, or maybe things that you're looking forward to.
What always pleases me the most is when there is a project we're making and it is so good and so powerful. And I'll give you an example. So just today, I walked down into our studio and there's a gentleman down there named Damien Eccles. And I don't know if you've ever heard of him. It's a long story, but he was wrongfully imprisoned for 2 decades. And he was let out of prison 5 years ago. And he's teaching, of all things, the esoteric practices of magic. And these are practices that he learned while he was in prison and that he practiced in prison. So I walked down to the studio. I just wanted to check in on the recording. How's it going? How's it going? And I heard his voice. And he was in the practice as he was teaching it. And he was describing the light that connects to the middle of these 4 pentagrams, one on each wall. And I was envisioning what his prison cell was like when he practiced this with the pentagrams on the wall and the light connecting in the center. Anyway, what completely thrilled me was I know that there's somebody out there, many people out there, who are going to listen to this, and they're going to do that practice right along with Damien Eccles and his deep, resonant voice. He was right in it as he was teaching it. And they're not going to be the same. They're not going to be the same. And they will have the opportunity to internalize that practice and make it their own. And it will be such a huge something planted inside them that will then grow and change them. And so that's what makes me happy, is when that kind of teaching is happening at Sounds True. And I tune in to the future recipient, whose life will never be the same as a result.
Do you get much chance to interact with the people who listen to the programs, and do you get in touch with what those changes are and how this is influencing them in their lives?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I get a lot of letters from Sounds True customers, and I run into people all over the place, and I hear a lot of stories, and I know that a lot of our programs helped people make different kinds of turns in their life. And I recorded an audio series myself, actually, called Being True. And someone wrote me a letter recently and said they were listening to the audio series while they were driving across country. And often people listen to audio programs while they're on a long drive. And this was a person who had some kind of traditional corporate job, but they really wanted to be a portrait painter of dogs. They wanted to paint dogs. And in listening to the program, they made the decision that they were going to devote themselves, that they were going to have the courage to be true and follow their own inner star. And as a gift, this person wanted to paint a portrait of the dog that lives with me now. And I just thought that was so wonderful that this person made such a huge life change and then wanted to give me that gift. So that's just an example. I'll tell you another weird example because it's funny. Someone who listens to the podcast that I host, which is called Insights at the Edge, named one of her chickens. You ready for this? She named her chicken Tami Simon. I don't know why I feel like telling these animal stories. It's kind of funny. But anyway, and so she wrote in and said, let me tell you what it's like living with Tami Simon. Tami Simon lays over 100 large eggs every year. And Tami Simon, is a little greedy when it comes to food. And she wrote this long letter. And my partner, Julie, decided to excerpt from her letter and make T-shirts that had the picture of this chicken called Tami Simon on it. Okay, so there have been some funny stories from customers, but at one point I hosted a series called the Self-Acceptance Project. And you ready for this? I would say I got close to 500 letters from people about that series, just about that series, and how it was a transformative force in their lives. Even a couple of people who said that they'd been thinking of killing themselves. And I say that seriously, it was really moving. But that in listening to hearing teachers talk about self-acceptance and their own struggles with self-acceptance, that even some of the great teachers we admire the most have had and still go through their own challenges with self-criticism and self-loathing, that was what normalized it for a lot of people and helped people treat themselves differently, treat themselves with more kindness.
It'd just be wonderful to have hear about the influence that initial work, which has grown so much, is having profound influence, profound changes in people's lives for the better, and not just in the lighthearted stuff. Because I love the animal stories are wonderful, but also that you do get to hear from those whose lives are not just nudged in a little more to the right kind of direction, but sometimes saved entirely.
Well, for whatever reason, what I'm thinking of is what it was like for me when my sister gave me a copy of Siddhartha. What was that like? How important was that to me as a young person? How it was almost like she threw me a life preserver, really, for the true life inside of me that needed a thread and needed someone to give voice. And so when somebody says, hey, you might like this program by Tami on awakening compassion, and somebody learns Tonglen practice for the first time and does Tonglen at the bedside of somebody who's suffering, th- those things are huge. I mean, that's it. That's the gift of the Dharma.
Well, let's shift a little bit to our other topic today, and this is a personal favorite, I think, of both of us, is dogs. And the new book, The Dharma of Dogs, Our Best Friends as Spiritual Teachers. Tell us about how that got started. What made you decide to do this book?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, on any given day, it sounds true, 110 employees come to work and 20-ish dogs come to work. And so this dog-friendly workplace, I will add that one cat and one bird who work in three separate wings of the building also often come to work at Sunstream. And so we're a dog-friendly place. And the original idea came from an editor who came up with this title and had a vision for the book. And as we started just talking about it and describing it, it morphed in certain ways away from her original vision into the idea that we wanted to receive short essays from spiritual teachers and artists and writers and dog lovers who really hold a spiritual vision, if you will, of the human canine relationship and how we can grow and evolve through the special medicine that dogs have. And kind of what I mean by medicine is the special gifts, not just that the species might be able to bring to humans, but specific individual dogs have brought. And basically how a spiritual teacher might have learned certain things about essential life truths from being in relationship with a special four-legged friend. So that was really the premise of the book, and we collected somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 different essays along with photos of the author and their dog.
So what are some of those stories from that collection that stood out for you? Anything that reminds you of your current dog or other dogs from your life?
Yeah, well, I think my favorite piece from the collection was by J.P. Sears. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a very gifted comedian, and he is Mr. Ultra Spiritual. So he's a very funny guy, but he wrote his whole piece from the perspective of his dog. So his dog wrote the piece, and his dog wrote the essay about kind of everything JP's learning in tutelage, if you will. And so I thought that was really a really funny angle to take. I think what touched me so much is just the tremendous heart opening that runs through the whole book. Every single piece has a heart opening theme. And yes, certain people, it had something to do with presence, and I learned more about just being in the moment. For other people, it was the story of their dog's passing and death that was the real initiation and the real teaching. Or one story was about how a dog was lost, and during the week of this person trying to find her dog, what she went through and how her heart was transformed in that process. So each story has its own gift and its own magic, if you will.
It's interesting hearing this story and the way you describe that there is a uniqueness to each dog. It's not just a species quality, although that's there certainly. There's also the unique quality that each dog brings, and thinking about the different dogs that I've had over the years, and learning a lesson very clearly from Buford, my first dogs, on just being present and not missing this beautiful walk in the woods with him, just the two of us, because of something else spinning around in my mind. And I'm wondering if there are any stories just from your life and your dogs that were aha moments for you in contemplative practice. What were some of the teaching moments your dog had for you?
Well, I met Jasmine, who was a blonde, floppy-eared, really good-looking Cocker Spaniel, at the same time that I met Julie, who is now my wife, and we've been together for about almost 16 years now. So I met the two of them together. And I think that in falling in love with Julie, Jasmine was kind of an extension, and they were a family unit that came into my life. And the two of them together healed my heart in a way that nothing to that point ever had. And I really think it was a quality of constancy. Not any one story I can tell you about Jasmine. It's that there was a quality of always being there. So even when in her final years she was deaf, and we're talking about deaf as a doornail, she lived to be 17. So even when the fire alarm went off in the house, the smoke alarm, she didn't stir. She was deaf. And she was also, towards the last couple years of her life, mostly blind, but not totally blind. But even then, if I would get up and leave the room, like at work, she would come with me to work. I'd get up to go to a meeting, leave the room. She always knew when I left. She always felt it, and she always stayed close. She would come with me into the bathroom with me. She just always wanted to be close. It was almost like at a certain point, I felt that she was part of my own body, like she was a leg or something like that. She was that close to me all the time. And there was such an incredible gift in that for me that allowed me to feel connected to another being, connected to the earth, because there's just something so earthy about animals, and that she was at my feet. And I would say I felt not alone in the world in a way that up till then, I think there had always been some kind of loneliness in me. But she really was, in the classic way they talk about your BFF, she was my BFF. And it healed me, I think, of a kind of core attachment wound. It helped heal me, she and Julie together, Jasmine and Julie together, that has been tremendously profound in my life.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm wondering if there's anything on this particular topic or maybe anything else you're working on that you'd like to share with the listeners.
Well, as we're talking about Jasmine, I think it's just really the power of a reciprocal bond of love. And, for me, I'm a dog person, but, I think people have that, in other ways in their life. And I think that sense of reciprocity and connection, I think what I discovered, and I discovered this when I was editing at one point, a program by Adyashanti, and it was called Spontaneous Awakening. And in the program, he asks people, what's your goal? What's your goal in the spiritual quest? And what are you really looking for? Tami, what were you looking for after you read that book when you were 16? What are you looking for? Why are you doing it? Why are you meditating? Why? And he takes you through this process where you keep asking, well, what do you think you'll get? You'll become liberated. Then what? You'll be free. Then what? Then what? Then what? What is it that you're looking for? And as I was editing this program, I was really thinking about it. At the time when I was doing it, I thought, you know what I want more than anything under this whole spiritual quest is just to feel like I'm connected. that I'm part of the fabric of life. I'm not separate. I'm actually truly linked. I could feel that sense of real connection because I never felt very connected to human beings. I kind of felt like an alien and stuff, early in my life. That's what I wanted. So isn't that interesting that the thing I wanted the most, I felt in a really ongoing, pervasive way, not so much through solitary retreat practice, which I've done quite a lot of in my life, but through hanging out with my dog.
Beautifully said, and probably very familiar to a few people who are listening right now. For those of you who are listening, we have a link to Sounds True on the website, the episode page for this episode. That's soundstrue.com. And we'll also be linking to the Dharma of Dogs, Our Best Friends as Spiritual Teachers, and maybe one or two other books as well. Our guest today, Tami Simon. Tami, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate the conversation today.
Ted, my pleasure, and I'm glad to meet a fellow Dharma-loving dog lover.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.